at Georgetown. And I'd just like to welcome you to our, I think this is the fourth or fifth installment this year of our speaker series. It's Excellence and Identity in Education, Transforming Policy and Practice. And we're very honored today to have two wonderful, amazing guests. Professor Tatyana Kleyn from City College, City University of New York, and Georgetown's own Susan Douglas of the Prince Al-Walid bin Talal Center for Muslim Christian Understanding, which is a co-sponsor for today's event.
Actually, CCAS.
Oh, CCAS, I'm sorry.
Okay. They're providing the food, and ACMC is providing the speakers. So.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, thank you for the joint sponsorship.
Which is more important? I think the food probably.
No, there's a material sustenance we all need, but there's an intellectual sustenance that transcends that. So it's hard to have neither for very long. So we're really grateful for that support. So the Educational Transformation Program, so over the last year and a half, we've launched a program, started in July of 2017, that takes as our mission addressing educational inequity and inadequacy in the United States, and particularly focusing on questions about race and class disparities in public education. But the critical lens that we use and deploy isn't limited to race and class in U.S. schools. And today we return to two elemental dimensions of the U.S. educational experience: immigration status of students and religious identity and traditions of Islam. And our guest speakers today are two renowned educators and scholars who, in the midst of today's political climate, do vitally important work addressing the real experiences and circumstances of students and families who are vulnerable to gross misinformation and bias. It should go without saying, but we do need to say it repeatedly, that facts matter and experiences and reality matters. And both scholars bring to the policy and political conversation important knowledge about the lives of students and families. And for doing that work, I want to thank both of you personally for undertaking that exceptionally important work, and we're happy to help spread that word today. Just a few words for each introduction about each of our speakers. Professor Tatyana Kleyn is Associate Professor and Director of the Bilingual Education and TESOL programs at City College of New York. She earned her EDD in International Educational Development at Teachers College, so she's anchored in New York. I don't think we'd be able to lure her away. Her dissertation focused on the intersections of bilingual multicultural education in Spanish, Haitian, Chinese, and Russian bilingual classrooms, and won the Outstanding Dissertation Award from the National Association for Bilingual Educators. She's the author of at least 2 books, and importantly for today, she's the director and co-producer of the Living Undocumented documentary series and another film, Una Vida Dos Países, Children and Youth Back in Mexico. And she'll be presenting today from her most recent film, I think, still undocumented. Dr. Susan Douglas received her PhD in history from George Mason University in 2016. She holds an MA in Arab Studies from Georgetown University Center for Contemporary Arab Studies and a BA in history from the University of Rochester. During 2006, she was a senior researcher for the United Nations Alliance of Civilizations Initiative and has served as an affiliated scholar of the Council on Islamic Education for over a decade, reviewing textbooks, state curriculum and standards, and developing instructional resources. And she's currently an educational consultant with the Al-Walid bin Talal Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. So I want to welcome both of them here today, and we'll start with Dr. Kleyn. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to set my timer, so I'm going to try to be good. So good afternoon, buenas tardes, dobre den. I'm really excited to be here. I have started corresponding with Krista, who I know is watching with Baby Davi, so I'm going to shout them out on Facebook Live. And we started this conversation about timing a long time ago, and I was hoping I could come during the cherry blossoms, but I came during the snow, and that's very beautiful. And I also want to I know there's people watching on Facebook Live, and give a shout out also to Jamie Schissel in North Carolina, because this is really, like, even though this is much bigger than this room, so I appreciate the outreach. So what I'm going to talk about today is, you know, as a scholar, I have this picture of this person who's a scholar, right? And we're supposed to be like sitting in these offices and not just typing away. And then who reads our work? Like the statistics are quite grim unless you're a very like big time scholar. So to me, I just kind of realized like to be an advocate scholar, we had to do more than just write. So today I'm going to be talking about how I have started trying to do this work multimodally to advocate and to also get people to have better understandings about immigration. So I want to start with sharing my own path because I think, you know, where we come from, where we, how we approach this matters, and our own stories matter, and how we share others' stories as well. I want to talk a little bit about multimodal approaches. Then we're going to screen Still Living Undocumented. It's an 18-minute film. Then I want to do a little bit of analysis of films for scholarship and activism, and then I believe at the very end we'll have time for questions. So, all of us do the work that we do because of our own past experiences. Sometimes it's good experiences, often in education, unfortunately, it's not so great experiences that we want to kind of change. So a little bit about my path and my positioning. I was born in the Soviet Union in a country that's now called Latvia. Russian was my home language. I also grew up where it was a little bit cold and snowy. And we came as political refugees to the United States because of the anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union. So I came to Columbus, Ohio, when I was about 5.5, and then we moved to Poughkeepsie, New York, which is very pretty and very boring. It's about 90 minutes north of New York City. I went to Roy C. Ketchum High School. Yes, the mascot, I believe, is still the Indian, so that's a whole nother kind of talk, right? But that was kind of where I grew up. And through high school, I was on a gymnastics team, and we were, our coach was amazing, and we traveled every year to another country. And this was the year we were the first high school team to compete in China. It's a little embarrassing because they don't have high school teams there. They have either you're going to the Olympics or you're not going to the Olympics. And we were not on the Olympic path at all. So that was, you know, a little weird. But it just kind of opened my eyes to this larger world, because even though I immigrated here, when you're 5.5, you really don't have that many memories, you know, from that age. So that kind of started opening up the world to me. And then I went to Ohio State. I don't know if there's any Buckeyes here, if anyone knows that Buckeye's a nut. Yes, isn't that a weird mascot? So I went to the Ohio State University, and then I ended up getting, I wasn't ready for like to just go into the real world. I still wanted to travel. So I ended up getting a job in education. I was a 3rd grade teacher, but I was able to work in Honduras, in Escuela Internacional San Tatyana, where I was like kind of helping the rich get richer, right? It was one of those international private schools, and it kind of opened up the world to me of inequity. Honduras is, you know, one of the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere. I felt like I was poor living there because all my students had nannies and maids and everything else, but it opened up my eyes to a larger world. So this kind of, and then finally I ended up at the City College of New York, which has, how many of you have been to that campus before? Gabriella raised her hand. She's the daughter of one of my best friends who goes to school here, so I'm very excited she could be here. So at the City College, where we have many of our students who are undocumented, and I started to see, wait a minute, my family suffered, your family suffered, but we were able to come here as refugees. They paid for, you know, the organization that sponsored us paid for our flight. Although we had to pay them back, they helped us find an apartment, they helped my parents have English classes. So all these supports, and when you're undocumented, not only do you not have any of those supports, but obstacles after obstacle after obstacle put up in your way, right? So I started to see like, wait, this doesn't feel right. You know, there are people suffering in different ways in different countries, and some people are allowed to come here, and other people have to literally risk their lives to come here. So that's kind of where I come to this work from. But, you know, this is a much bigger issue. And so what are like the current issues going on right now? ICE is everywhere. This has been deemed a quote unquote national emergency by our president, I guess. And I have this as winter police because one of my colleagues who used to teach actually 3rd grade in this area, there was a raid many years ago near Virginia, and she told me her students came to school the next day and they said, my dad was taken away by the winter police. So that's how students are understanding or not understanding what is going on. So for me as an educator, how we talk about these things and the fact that we have to talk about these things in schools really kind of struck me. We also, the Pew, the Southern Poverty Law Center, did a study about the Trump effect, where they looked at incidents that were reported in nearly every state, incidents of hate. And this is actually before he was elected, but just during the elections, right? During the elections. And what they found was that the largest percent of incidents were occurred on university campuses and in K-12 schools. And they were dominated by anti-immigrant incidents and anti-Muslim incidents, which kind of brings, these two areas are not separate. And, I'm talking about immigration today, but no one is just an immigrant, right? We're migrants, we're gendered, we're racialized, all of these things, right? So, and these incidents, were anti-Black, anti-Semitic, anti-LGBTQ, anti-women, anti-nationalist, and also anti-Trump. So within this context, when you look at schools, I don't know if you remember a few months ago, there were these teachers that were at after-school professional development and dressed up as the wall, right, for Halloween, and eventually they were punished eventually. But this is. We have hate crimes happening, but we also have these kinds of perspectives and views that students are having to deal with when they're coming into schools. But I want to share some good news, right? Because in these times, we have to kind of seize the good moments. So as you know, I'm in New York, and New York, the Assembly and the Senate just passed, both bodies passed the New York State DREAM Act, which would allow our students to have access to financial aid. Right now they get in-state tuition for public universities, but they don't have access to financial aid. So paying that out of your pocket is still a much bigger hurdle. We're still waiting on Governor Cuomo to sign it. He needs to sign it by April 1st in order to go into the budget. But with only 5 to 10% of undocumented students going to college, this would really help students in New York State, and other states have the DREAM Act as well. So with immigration, we see on the federal level, we see things that are very problematic. But in some states, we do see states pushing back against what's happening on a national scale. So now I want to talk a little bit about my work towards justice, right, in a multimodal way. So obviously, when you're in academia, how many of you are faculty here? Right, so sole authored, top tier peer-reviewed journals, right? And then like, oh yeah, a book chapter, that's kind of what you're supposed to do. So some of my work, I've also done books, and then as it was mentioned in the introduction, one of the books I did was for youth. So that to me is more impactful but not always counted or not always valued in a university setting. I think creating curricula is very important. This is actually one that we did with El Diario La Prensa, which is the oldest Spanish daily newspaper in New York, to celebrate their 100th anniversary. So getting this work into schools, writing letters to the editor is very important, right? And then media, being able to speak with media to get your voice out to a larger audience so that you can share this, because again, not everyone's picking up a scholarly journal article. And it always kind of blows my mind when you if you don't have access to a college library, how you click on a journal and it's like, it's $45 for a journal article. I'm like, how can an article be $45? Like, I don't understand. And also speaking in educational communities, but also speaking in non-academic spaces, right? Where we're not always speaking to the choir, although speaking to the choir is important too. And then what I'm going to talk about today, which is films. So why multimodality? Well, writing is important, and I'm not taking anything away from writing, because that's critical. But what I also think is that writing is insufficient, especially if we want to reach a broader audience. So it's written work and other things. For me, it's been film, but there's so many ways, and I feel like we don't even know all the different ways that there are to advocate multimodally. It's all evolving. So our world is very multimodal, and academia, I would say, is predominantly monomodal. We're trying, like some programs like, oh, we're starting a Facebook page. Our Facebook is now like just for old people, right? So who are we even reaching? I'm on Facebook. Okay. I have Twitter too, but I'm not good at it. And then, what we do with multimodal scholarship is we try to build bridges to different people. So, and how do we do that? We build bridges across people who have different levels of formal education. So you don't need to have a formal level of education to understand migration, right? People who experience this are really the experts in this, and because of the experiences that they're living in, may not have access to that formal education. It allows us to move across languages with films. All my films, we make sure we have subtitles, at least in Spanish, and I would love to have, subtitles in other languages too. Across economic groups, across age groups. Some of our films we've showed to a 5th grade audience, right? And you can show, bridge that across geographical areas. And something that I always try to do with my films is a non-negotiable I have is it must be available online for free and accessible to everybody, because I don't think education and information is something people should have to pay for. So a lot of people always ask me, like, oh, where can I get the film? Where can I buy it? And I'm like, you can't. Just go online and watch it, right? Use it. But I do want to kind of talk a little bit about academic work as well and how that can have an advocacy impact. I worked a while ago with 3 students who were undocumented, and we wrote together about their own testimonials. And I'm gonna kind of go over this quickly. So this is the article where I had them write their own testimonials about a moment in their educational trajectory that was really powerful, and as a way to have that as a lesson for other educators, like what can we learn from their experiences. So what happened with that is New York State was suing the Trump administration, who was trying to end the DACA program. And they used our article in the amicus brief of which ended up, they won. They were actually the 2nd state to win. California sued first. They won, so DACA continued. And then New York was the 2nd state. So for me, it's like, it's not just films, it's our research as well, but getting it into the hands of people who are policymakers, who are lawyers, and kind of also building bridges across fields. So education can't do it all. Psychology can't do it all. Law can't do it all. But we have to work across these fields. And I feel like that's something we also don't do in academia. We're all in our own little boxes. And we just try to go really deep, deep, deep instead of making these connections. So actually, I'm very excited that next semester at the CUNY Grad Center, we're hopefully going to be teaching a course with myself, a psychologist, and an immigration lawyer, looking at immigration from all these perspectives, because again, it's very limiting when we just do it from one lens. And as you know, that people with DACA can no longer leave the country, apply to leave the country. That used to be the case. And also with DACA, there are no new applications. So what that means is that for students who are in high school now, there's no path to even the DACA program, which is really not a path to anywhere. It's just a short-term Band-Aid. So politicians love to focus on numbers. The media loves to talk about statistics, right? And it's important to have a sense of where we are with these things. So we have about 11 million undocumented immigrants in this country. 1.1 million are under 18, so children and youth, however you define youth. But we also have US-born citizen children with undocumented parents. So that's 4.1 million. So you see how it just keeps growing, right, exponentially. Then we can look at undocumented students who've lived in the US for 5 or more years, and it's only about 65,000. And again, that's 5 to 10% who are going to college. And it's not because they're not smart, and it's not because they can't do it, but it's because there are policies in place that are preventing them from accessing higher education, right? We know that K-12 is very clean, and that because of Plyler versus Doe, you must have access. But then when we get to college, every state kind of does their own thing. So depending on where you are, it's impossible or still very challenging. So, and this is the DACA program, and I've briefly discussed it. And I think something to remember about the DACA program is it only impacts less than 10% of undocumented immigrants in this country. So for a while, DACA was taking up all the media coverage, and it was addressing so few. So I always like to remind people that all undocumented students do not qualify for DACA, right? And in New York State, that's, for some of my students, it's heartbreaking because they want to become teachers. and we need bilingual teachers, and we have a shortage, and here they are, and they want to do this, and they can't, right? But this is not really about people having resources or that can help our society at the end of the day. This is about social justice and people being able to not be called illegal and people being able to live where they're safe, right? So my work has been to move beyond these labels and move beyond these numbers and to share stories, because I feel at the end of the day, what you remember are stories, not numbers. So in 2012, we did the film Living Undocumented, High School, College, and Beyond. This is the City College campus in Harlem. And we did that film, and right at the end of the film was when the DACA program was announced. So we had 6 people in the film. Some qualified for DACA, some didn't. And they all kind of shared their stories. And then what we did 5 years later was we followed up on 3 of the people, 2 who got DACA and 1 who did not. So what we're gonna do now is watch the film, and then I'll talk a little bit more. So maybe if we can dim the lights, and hopefully the technology is gonna work. And you have 2 screens to choose from, which is kind of pretty, never seen this before.
Sometimes I consider myself American, but because the country keeps denying me of that right, I am back to not being from here, not being fully Mexican because I'm not there. I don't share a lot of the, things that I'm missing out in back home. So I guess that sometimes I just feel like I'm in that gray area of not knowing what to call myself, but just knowing that I feel that I belong here.
Effective immediately, the Department of Homeland Security is taking steps to lift the shadow of deportation from these young people. Eligible individuals will be able to request temporary relief from deportation proceedings and apply for work authorization.
The Department of Justice has advised the President and the Department of Homeland Security that the Department of Homeland Security should begin an orderly, lawful wind down.
Let's switch gears now to DACA. A federal judge in California has temporarily blocked the Trump administration's decision to end the program. What does this mean for the president and the immigration reform?
So a lot has changed and happened since 5 years ago. Right after we finished filming, Deferred Action became a real program. So by December, I applied and I was able to get Deferred Action. The teachers who hired me were the ones also watching the film at one point. So that's how they found out about me, and that's how I was able to get the job.
I don't identify just as being an undocumented immigrant, but I feel like it is a big part of who I am. And the fact that I am undocumented has made me the person I am today.
Wow, since living undocumented, there have been many changes in my life. Personally, the biggest change that I've had is that I got married. It's been amazing so far, It hasn't been all rainbows and unicorns, but I think nothing worth having is rainbows and unicorns. We are now living in Puerto Rico. Hi, Yogan. Say hi, Yogan. Say hi. Can you daddy a kiss? Hey. So this is Yogan's other dad. This is my husband. Dad. And this is our child.
When I decided to apply for medical residency, I applied to Puerto Rico due to the mainly the location and the population that was pretty similar to my home country, which is Cuba.
What I loved, the thing was that we ended up finding a way to connect, and then we found a thing that Puerto Rico, like us, was at that midpoint.
My family moved to the United States 1981, so I was about a year old. And they came on student visas, and after about 4 years, those visas expired. And, me and my brother were still here, and so by the time I was 5, I became undocumented.
On the cover of Time magazine, here I am, right there. And I remember being at this photo shoot, and we all had to say, what was our identity. I remember just thinking, I'm an undocumented American. And this cover says that this cover does say that we are Americans. When we were filming Living Undocumented last time, I think it was back in 2012, and right around that time DACA was announced, and sadly, unfortunately, I wasn't a part of it. And so it was kind of disappointing to me because I was 32 at the time, and they made the cutoff 31 and a half, something like that. Here I am today, 5 years later, without any kind of immigration relief. That was just a very enlightening experience, being able to go back to Mexico and being able to reconnect with my roots and being able to see where I came from.
Personally, I've been able to go back to Mexico to visit my grandparents. They have changed a lot, and in my memory, they stayed the same way when I left. So then to just go back and see them older, with more illnesses that they have now, being unable to walk on their own, that was a little bit heartbreaking.
Shortly after being there, I realized that I wasn't where I belonged. And that was like the bitter part of it, because I saw that even though I had yearned so long to go back and to see my grandma, I hadn't seen in such a long time, aunts, uncles, cousins, and they were very embracing and very welcoming. But it came to the point where I saw like I was visiting, I wasn't home.
When President Trump had won, I just told everybody to give a chance, and I guess within the first couple months of office, he did some travel bans from Muslim countries, and there was rumor news stories about people being deported, and I just thought maybe the chance is over.
I was fearful for me, my family, being undocumented, knowing that he said that he was gonna just deport everyone. And even when I got to school, a lot of our children were really, they couldn't understand what was happening. They were like, well, what? So my mom said that they're gonna send us back, that I'm not gonna be with them. So seeing that also was really shocking to see that a 5-year-old is worried about not knowing what his family is gonna be when he goes back home.
After the presidential election, it was brought up to my attention that Living Undocumented had received a couple comments. I was a bit hesitant to go and see those comments because I knew they were, this time more than anything, they were really directed towards me and the group of people who participated in filming the first film. Should I read these comments? Should I bother looking? I was like, is it worth it? I was intrigued, and my curiosity got the better of me, and I did read them. They were very mean, cruel comments. They didn't instill fear in me. They instilled more disappointment. When I filmed Living Undocumented first, I never spoke or shared my story because I wanted to impose my viewpoints on anybody else, or I wanted to change anybody's viewpoint. The only thing I sought to do is what I love to do, which is educate. And then after reading those negative comments, I was like, well, I guess we have to continue educating, and we have to continue teaching, and we have to continue speaking.
A little bit about the school where I teach. It's a school where, for the most part, a lot of the students come from immigrant families. I am part of the dual language program. It's very exciting to see children continuing to learn Spanish. One of the moms of one of our children came up to me after we were dismissing the kids, and she was like, "Oh, you know, my child said that when she grows up, she wants to become a teacher just like you." And I was like, "Oh, that's so nice." So just to be able to hear that, it was kind of like, it was a very interesting feeling, I would say, because I was like, "Oh, if I wouldn't have had DACA, I would have never heard this before. There was no way for me to be able to be here right now in this moment and to be able to hear this from her." So when your professors told you that teaching wasn't easy, they weren't lying. In today's world, we need to be more than teachers. We need to be advocates. Someone who fights for the well-being of our children. I was inspired to pursue my true calling in the field of education. Around the same time when I was trying to finish my bachelor's degree, some very anti-immigrant laws were being passed around the country. All of these laws were criminalizing immigrants, criminalizing people like my family and I. So that's when my organizing experience started. Thank you for having me here today. And class of 2017, may the force be with you.
We decided to start the dream team because we just thought we needed a space where we can go and just to talk to other people where, you know, you wouldn't feel judged and people would understand. Now people know who we are at City College. Our logo is next to the school logos at different events.
When I started to really look around at the members of the dream team, I knew that I looked different and that we come from different backgrounds and different religions and different cultures. But I think that's the point of the dream team. There is no face or no race or gender to the face of undocumented students.
When you walk into that room filled with people who, you know, have the same struggles, who care about the same issues, who are there to understand you, you walk out with a totally different light or a totally different perspective.
I went to a protest in Union Square, and when I got there, I just saw so many people, and it was overwhelming. It was there was so much support. It wasn't just undocumented people, but there were other people there, just fighting for us.
I never thought that would, would become something that would benefit us. I always doubted the system. So when that happened and I saw how my life changed, and it was thanks to all these people that were marching, that were doing something, that were advocating that, and what did I do? I never did anything. So I said, no, I have to do something.
Being of Mexican origin and living in Puerto Rico is a 180 from my experience in New York. There's no social status different. There's no stigmas. There's no hierarchies. I think that's something very positive that I needed to experience and that I got to experience here. It made me feel welcome. And being Mexican for the first time wasn't something bad. I'm currently enrolled at the University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras, and I'm part of the education program here, studying a master's in special education. As an undocumented immigrant with DACA, I'm able to live and work in Puerto Rico because Puerto Rico is part of the United States. It is a U.S. territory because DACA grants me a working permit and a social security number. All the benefits are also applied here. DACA has permitted me to be a teacher, which is something that I absolutely love doing.
So all your senses tell your brain what's going on around you.
I love being part of the education process of children. I love contributing to children's growth. And if it weren't for DACA, I wouldn't be able to do that because I wouldn't be able to work as a teacher.
I think a lot of people don't understand that this immigration issue, especially those who are older and don't have anything, like they don't have DACA, they don't have anything. It's like we kind of have to work, and this is not disparaging. We just kind of have to work at these jobs which are not career-like, and because I guess that's how we support ourselves in a sense. So just having so much time and effort in these jobs, it just kind of took away from my hopes and dreams at the time because I couldn't really move on. There needs to be some solution to all this because we're still here. My parents have been here 30 years. I've been here 30 years as well. For them never to get status, for me to never get status, for there's no DREAM Act, there's no DACA for me, I think it just exemplifies how difficult it is and how arduous, complex, and not easy as critics would say. You know, my grandparents did it this way. They did it the right way, but I can't.
I did have an experience where I was not reminded, but kind of like brought back to reality that, hey, you're still undocumented. And it was when I was traveling from Puerto Rico to visit family here in New York, and I was stopped by an immigration officer at the airport. I vividly recall my heart beating faster than ever, feeling as if it was going to come out of my chest, and I felt a rush of adrenaline, I felt hot, I felt cold, I felt every possible physical reaction that you could think of. All of a sudden, I was stopped and I was asked citizenship. I said Mexican. I was like, step to the side. And I was like, oh my God, I need to see passport and documentation. I was so nervous, I didn't know what to say, I didn't know how to react. But in the next few months, if Trump's administration chooses to, I can be stopped anywhere and I can be asked those exact same questions. And God knows how long I will be able to say I have DACA and this is the immigration status that I've been given. And who knows, maybe one day that will be enough and then it'll be step to the side and then get on this van or follow me to this room, God forbid. So yeah. Even though DACA has come, like, we still need more.
My hopes for the next 4 years are that as a community we'll become stronger, just to really stand up for each other, stand up for our Muslim brothers and sisters, stand up for the immigrant community. I feel like now is the time that all of us unite.
My hope and dream has been the same since so many years, just to become a great federal judge. For me to get to that point, it's just kind of, well, anyway, the point is, I need to take the first step and get me there.
It's a wrap for that.
Wait, hold on, wait. I do want to say something here. All right, so, yeah, I do want to mention this. I always get like, okay, I gotta go. People will always ask me why I do this. You know, my mom will always say, you know, just let the next Korean person if they want to do it. And I always thought, for me, for other people, you know, those who have psychosocial issues about depression, suicide, I want to think about them. I think we lost so many people over the years. You know, it's great if I got married, it's great if I had DACA, blah, blah, blah. But I hope that they can follow my lead a little bit and say, okay, you know, maybe we shouldn't sweep this under the rug and that we can actually work together. Because it has to be more than just telling our stories, which we've done so many times. We've done so many video articles and newspaper articles, radio interviews. It has to be more than that. And I know people are afraid, but I think in order to get legislation done, we need to rally around this idea of causes. Hopefully organizations and individual talents will merge so that the American public will understand that it's just not like, oh, well, this person is illegal or undocumented. More about this person hopefully deserves a chance to have the American dream.
Hair, makeup.
Thanks, babe. We're gonna leave it at you.
New York.
In New York, probably.
We'll put this in line and after the credits.
So the film, as I said, is available online in addition to a teaching and resource guide. So what we would like is for this to be a tool in schools to be used to start having these conversations, right? So people don't have to come out, especially in times like this, to tell their stories unless they want to, right? So we can watch these videos and then have a conversation together about the experiences through the people in the film. And I should say that Irving has been able to change his status. And it was amazing because after that, him and his husband, they were like, it was like, where's Waldo, like on Facebook. Like every day they were like in another country. He's like, I'm making up for all this lost time and like traveling across the world, which is amazing. It's just such a limited, window for people. And, with Jungmin's story, he's really struggling to find his way when he doesn't have the support, even though he was one of the original people to start fighting for the DREAM Act in the early 2000s, and then to be just cut out of the DACA program, and then to be, then I don't know, some of you may remember there was a expanded DACA program, and so he was going to fall into that. And then they cut that program too. So it's been really whirlwind. So what I want to my work with these films is kind of to reprioritize the voices, right? So the media has such a strong say in kind of the way that we conceive things. And, if you even think about, the president's like little sound bites and how they get played over and over and over, and people start kind of internalizing that and believing that. So, and then politicians, will you take up this language as well and use it in policies? And if I'm thinking about bilingual education, we just stopped using limited English proficient in federal policy, right? It was only under ESSA that now we're only talking about English language learners, where we're trying to be so far ahead of that. So policy and politicians kind of impact the way we use language, and then the general public takes that up and incorporates that into their language practices. And then academics, a lot of if you read academic articles, people will try to create our own language, and to the extent that gets taken up is interesting. But often it's the people impacted that have the least say in their experiences, and in their voices are heard the least, right? So through these films, what we can try to do is kind of flip that and say, like, here's a counter narrative, or here's a narrative from a person who has lived this experience. So when it comes to academia and when it comes to film, like, there's different ways to characterize it. Is it a methodology of research? Is it just a way to disseminate what we do? Is it a service to the community? All of the above, none of the above. This is not a test, right? But I kind of see it, I say, like, it really depends, right? Because film can be used as a case study or ethnography. Here I do it with participants, but I'm sure you've seen work where people give people cameras, right, and have them record their own experiences. So that's another much more intimate way to do it. You can film interviews, focus groups, observations. It is clearly a way to disseminate information, right, across education levels, age groups, language literacies, and with the voices coming more directly from the people. Now, I will say, as a producer and as a director of the film, at the end of the day, I do have say into what gets heard and what doesn't, right? Otherwise, we'd have to be here for 5 hours, right? But that does, take away some of the power from the people in the film and put it in the hands of somebody else. And then the analysis is self-directed. So what you'll notice is we don't have voiceovers, or we don't have people telling you what to think or summarizing it for you. We're sharing with you and then having the audience make their own analysis of it. Film as a service to the community, right? Bringing together groups of people to have these conversations, using it as a tool in school and online to reach a much larger audience. Some of my work has also been with working in Mexico, and having people talk about having people talk about immigration in film is touchy, right? People, you're just gonna, hi, I brought my camera, can we? No, it's about creating relationships with people. And when I was in Mexico and looking at return migration, one of the first things somebody said to me was, eres de la migra. You know, like, what are you doing? And I was like, but she's in Mexico, but her kid's father was here in the United States, and her kid's father was here undocumented without DACA, right? So now we kind of joke about that, you know, like, I swear the opposite. But it's really about building trust in the complexity that a camera brings. And as those of you know that have interviewed somebody, you know, you will record them with our phone, but it's not until we turn the phone off that the best stuff comes out, right? Because people feel so that, you know, it is attention. And then, of course, people give consent, but there's still exposure and they're still putting themselves at some risk. So it's a complicated thing. So I just really want to show you just a short trailer of the work in return migration. And when we talk about return, that is, of course, deportation, but not only deportation, right? That's about people having to return when they feel like they don't have any other choice around the circumstances of being undocumented. But there are some people that say, I want to come here, I want to make money, I want to do this, and I want to go back, and they do. But there's more than 500,000 US-born children in Mexico right now that are being educated in their schools. This was a study that I did in Oaxaca, and a film that we did in Oaxaca, and this is just like a super short trailer. We can keep the lights on that I would like to show you briefly. You have to do it this way. Let's see.
I was 11 or 12 years old once my parents told me that we were coming back to Mexico.
Oh no, I messed it up. Hold on, sorry.
I was 11 or 12 years old once my parents told me that we were coming back to Mexico.
I was born in Oaxaca, but I love to speak English, and I feel more American.
I'm from USA, but I love to speak Spanish, both.
¿Cuándo viene, papi? ¿Cuándo viene?
En la escuela, pues yo le digo a Carla, es la que a veces me rinde un poquito menos, y ella me dice de repente, es que no está mi papi.
Me quiere mucho, papá.
I want to help other people here so they can learn English too.
There's always going to be one kid that doesn't know Spanish. You got to help more of the kid. You got to understand that he's different.
So another view of migration, right? That it's not linear, that it's not just from point A to point B, sometimes from point A to point B, back to point A, and then sometimes to point C again, and the complexities of that. And of course, under this administration, that's becoming more and more of a reality for families. So again, so what we did with this film is that we not only created a curriculum for the film that is in English and Spanish. It's huge. I feel like the film is really, people have been watching the film, but I wonder that how much the curriculum is being used, because I think showing a film is great, but it's not enough, right? We have to kind of dig a little bit deeper. So we created this 90-page curriculum, and we also did a guide for teachers in Mexico. Because a lot of times these students, they kind of fit in, they have similar names, they look similar to the people in their classroom, so sometimes they just come across as struggling students, because a lot of these students have been educated in the US, not in bilingual, but in primarily English-dominant settings, so they struggle in Mexico, right? So it's just trying to raise people's awareness through, again, this morning I just submitted a book proposal for this, so we'll see what happens, but writing, but also film and curriculum and guides for teachers, so doing this work in different ways to reach different audiences. So going back to the question that I answered, what is film? I think just thinking more broadly, if we want, that's my timer, so I'm just gonna go over by 1 minute. So if we want our work to go beyond the ivory towers, we have to look for ways to reach broader audiences. We're in the 21st century, so we have to embrace that. And social justice for migration and education requires dialoguing across borders, right? This is not just knowledge for knowledge, it's knowledge for change that we're trying to create. So now going back to that question, what is the answer? What is film? I think film is all of the above. It can be used as a research tool, as a dissemination approach, and community service, depending on the goal, content, and the context. So I think hopefully that gives you a little bit of a window into how I have perceived working multimodally, and I look forward to the session where we can have a dialogue at the end. Thank you. Do you know how to change?
I hope so.
I see it.
Oh, you mean to make
Yes,
it come up?
yes, let's see. Oh, is your name?
But
oh no, it's
it's
not on
not
there. You know what? Let
coming
me take this out.
This is not. Yeah, okay. Because it was on your laptop.
Right, I just
So it's the
disconnected it.
Zoom computer that needs to. Voila.
There we go.
Okay. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for having me here. I'm going to ask you to switch emotional gears here, because what I'm talking about is a lot more abstract, shall we say. But at the same time, I think it's really immediate, because I'm talking about teaching about the world. And what all the background to what Tatyana was talking about is, what are people's attitudes about others? What are people's attitudes about the world out there when they grow up in an atmosphere of schooling that really emphasizes the nation, national narratives, national belonging, you know, the idea of the homogeneous nation, none of which, I mean, there's hardly a homogeneous nation anywhere in the world. And so much conflict has resulted from that. So it's really a contradiction in terms. We all live in the world, and everybody loves to talk about globalization, but they're often just thinking about being ready for economic globalization and not for, you know, spiritual and social globalization. So I'm going to take you through a journey of how what we call talking about the world, teaching about the world, came about. Let's see which of the buttons is going to make this happen. Okay, there we go. So social studies curriculum is the place where this mostly lives. In the world that I would like to live in, it would be multidisciplinary, so that education at the elementary level and from then on up would be integrated learning, science, social studies, humanities, language, all kind of together. But for a long time, the Expanding Horizons curriculum, you might want to talk about this in terms of like Mr. Rogers' neighborhood idea, the sort of ideal, very outdated at this point. But the curriculum would begin with the self and the home and move out to, you know, our locality and our country. And then by 6th grade, imagine that, you've already been in school for almost 7 years, then the world is presented. And even though this has become somewhat outdated, it's still embodied in most curriculum sequences in the United States, in the states and state standards. That's how it is. And however, the Expanded Horizons model has been put under the microscope to the point where, you know, people talk about, well, there's students who come by 2nd grade or 1st grade who already experienced multiple countries, experienced multiple cultures in their country, in their own homes, and of course bilingualism and so on, and even just walking down a street in a city like New York or many other places, you're going to see evidence of the world around you. To say nothing of the simple exercise of looking where your toys come from and where your clothing comes from. So one of the first things, I'm a world history teacher, that's what my degree is in. I've been interested in it for a long time. I was almost at George Mason the only student of world history. All of the other PhD students were, except for one sort of, were US history students. That's just how it is, many of them on a teaching track. So when I've taught world history, which I've done in multiple settings from elementary to graduate school, people say, well, why should we learn about this? And so I have sort of two answers to that. Of course, we're all coming together all over the world. People travel, people come here, you see things on TV. But most importantly, we have, as human beings, a collective memory. There's a way that we got to where we are that is not just attributable to one person's culture or to one group's culture, and the other ones are all just some kind of bystanders. We have experienced collective learning over time, and that is what has brought us to this technological state, I will add, for better or for worse. But memory is a really important part of our being human, not just to pass on knowledge and to not have to reinvent everything every generation, but each of us, and this picture shows a griot from West Africa, a person who relates the stories of their group, of their family unit. But each of us is a transmitter of knowledge about the past, our own past and those of others. And if this weren't true, there wouldn't be such an effort at the level of states to try to make sure that students know certain things. So I'm going to look at how the structures of these learnings happen in schools. There are basically 3 different models for teaching about the world that are in school. Almost all of you who are in this room probably got exposed to it one way or another, regardless of where you grew up. Even it's a kind of a global thing, in fact, as well. It may come out of the colonial period, and I think it comes out of the rise of mass education per se, which was often influenced by British and French models and other European models. But what's important to think about this is, what's the unit of organization around which these courses are built, whether they're at 6th grade or whether they're at 10th grade or whether they are administered as a required course for, say, freshmen in college. The first one is the geographic perspective, the second one, the civilizational perspective, and the third one is the world history perspective, and I'll show you what those building blocks look like. So the geographic perspective is built on continents or world regions. The world divided up in continents, you're supposed to have learned those in like 2nd or 3rd grade, and you go through them and you cut them out in paper, or you put them on a balloon globe or something like that. The civilizational perspective is much less neutral because it is built on descriptions of world civilizations. World history has often been made up of a sequence, a linear sequence, at least perceived as a linear sequence of civilizations one after the other. That term is not neutral by any stretch of the imagination, and we'll expand upon that as we look at it. The world history perspective, however, is built around a series of world eras or periods of time across the globe. So in other words, you're not considering parts and pieces, either continents or other. You're looking at the globe at a particular period of time, beginning with very early prehistory or even astronomical history, even the history of geological history, and then you're looking at the short period when human so-called civilization emerges. You're looking at the entire globe and what's going on in it, the processes that interact and so forth. And we'll see how that very hugely differs. So the geographic perspective is the standalone geography course. These have become very prevalent in sort of what I call a burst of adultism. Let's lay the world on them at 6th grade, like right away, let's tell them all the contemporary stuff and we'll give it to them. But it's also often so boring that students really don't grab onto it with a lot of imagination. They often give their first view of the whole world. They're taken on a tour of the world full of descriptive facts. Where are the mountains? Where are the rivers? Where are the plains? What's the capital of this, and what resources do those people have, and so on. And that would be fairly neutral and not as freighted as it actually becomes. But again, it's organized, and this is why it's freighted, it's organized around a sequence of regions that are based on modern divisions of the world, despite the fact that one of the hallmarks of geographic thinking that has come out since Goals 2000 in the 90s has been that people create regions to help them understand the world, and that these change over time. But the standalone geography course takes a picture in time of strategic regions today. So this division makes it really hard to teach about or appreciate, more importantly, earlier historical regions, which were very different, interacting zones like oceans. interactive zones across deserts and things like that. So these are just out of the picture because as you'll see right now, we have, this is an AP map. And of course, what's the word up there at the end with the exclamation point? Mercator. Mercator is this, notorious map projection that was actually made to emphasize the seas, not the lands. But it's become so prevalent that this is actually an advanced placement map that was put up online. What does it distort most enormously?
Africa.
It totally distorts Africa, but what is it like distort in the Northern Hemisphere? Hugely out of proportion to reality. Obviously, Greenland is a big island, but it's fairly small. And if you can fit any number, there's another corrective of this that shows you how many countries in the Northern Hemisphere fit into Africa. It's a lot. China, the United States, Canada, and a number of other ones. And Greenland would be just a little piece. So this map has become prevalent from the time of the so-called age or European age of exploration, and is often used in classrooms. One of the reasons I heard that was the worst was that, well, the kids in the back of the room can read the labels on it in the Northern Hemisphere. But what it does is create this very distorted idea of what the world actually looks like. And taking the Southern Hemisphere, which used to be, you'll see in a moment, called the developing world, the third world or so, and diminishes its size and hence its importance. And of course, Europe, which is a peninsula of Eurasia, off of Asia, is much, much larger in this proportion. Here is, again, world strategic regions. Very many geography books are built around this. Here's a sort of Middle East that now extends all the way into Central Asia, not because it ever was that way, but because probably there's oil and gas there, and that's kind of the trope that goes with the idea of the Middle East. Actually, if you think about it, the Near East was considered the Mediterranean, the Eastern Mediterranean. The Far East, we all know, what is it, China and Korea and Japan. So where would the Middle East be? Would have been India, right? Near East, Far East, Middle East, and it was. And there's a wonderful thing you can find at Duke University, University of North Carolina, consortium on the Middle East. It's called Where is the Middle East? It's a slideshow that shows how this region has changed since the end of the 19th century. But again, this is how a geography book would be divided up into these strategic regions, and they're often military economic zones, post-colonial economic zones. So before you're even starting to study, you're already studying a configuration that exists in the minds of the West rather than the people who live there. This is even more striking. The three worlds. The first world, of course, being the capitalist world. This is a Cold War map, and the second world being the communist world, which at the time was Russia and its satellites in Eastern Europe and China, and little old Cuba, of course, in the Caribbean. And then the third world, the yellow, the developing nations, the nations that had been colonized. And that model, even though it's not overt anymore, is there embedded in the sequence of geography books, because those countries come last in the sequence. So that, again, the connections. You get a mini history of Europe, and then you get a mini history of maybe the New World outgrowth of Europe, and then months and months later, you might study the Middle East, even though you're learning about how this is a strategic zone that has all sorts of implications for Europe. And again, look at the map. Again, it's Mercator. So studying one of these books, and the most common courses now, the standalone geography courses, run across grades 6 and 7 and do Eastern Hemisphere, Western Hemisphere. And sometimes, believe it or not, I've seen Europe mentioned a lot in the Western Hemisphere, even though it clearly is not there. But what happens is that students are treated to these sort of one region after another silos. And these books are characterized not only by a description of these places, but also a mini history. And I mean many, so many that, like, when you're talking about the Middle East, I've seen, this is literally what I've seen in a couple of books, is a paragraph on Muhammad and the rise of Islam, just the Middle East, right? And then a paragraph later, modern Saudi Arabia. I'm like, huh? Like, was there anything between that for like 1,400 years? You know, maybe a little. But again, what's the problem? And here's a little graphic that sort of helps you to sort of look at it. If you're teaching, you're sending a class down a series of manholes. You can't really get them to understand, if you're going into history, what was the connection between the Indian Ocean and sub-Saharan Africa? What were the connections between South Asia and Southeast Asia, or the Middle East and Southeast Asia, or the Far East across the Silk Road? You can't do that because you're looking at now today's regions. And the fact that they're sort of semi-locked into this idea of the third world, first world, second world situation, you often have this mini history so truncated that it actually enhances stereotyping, because it's like, oh, well, that's how the world is. But there's not enough time to explain how did this situation of first world, second world, third world, or simply developed versus less developed or developing. I mean, there's all kinds of euphemisms you can use to get around it, but it all says the same thing. So how come they are that? And often those chapters in those books, even when they go around issues and not just descriptions of geographic stuff, often they are intractable problems that are sort of issue-oriented, and that's because the people are, and then there's this binary that comes out between tradition and modernity. And there's no brooking a bridge between the two. Either you give up tradition and become modern, or whatever. And it's really very problematic in so many ways, because this is, maybe imagine this, you're a sixth grader. It's the first impression you've gotten of the world as a whole to have a chance to study it. I much prefer the sugar cube, pyramids and the aluminum paint sheets that you would put on for like medieval armor, because at least you're getting like the stories of history in there somewhere, instead of this adultism driven, kind of thing. So the manholes, you send your students up and down, they're just strictly really silos. Okay, so now we go to option 2. The building block here is the civilizational perspective. This is what most world history courses have been organized around for, we're getting on to over 200 years now, because these courses began to emerge as mass schooling began to emerge in the early 19th century. And the criterion, of course, is this. In order to be able to study such a thing, you have to determine whether a group, a society, was a civilization or not. And you can imagine how fraught that becomes. And it has been that way from the beginning. And I'll show you some images that will really do it. But how does it go again? Students are given chapter by chapter descriptions of world civilizations, a description of its geographic setting, the 7 hills of Rome or whatever it is, an account of its origins, a founder, sometimes if it's like a religious movement that is associated with civilization, or the founding members of an empire, and then descriptions of its political, social, and cultural history. And what was added by multiculturalism with great anguish from the 1960s and 70s on was then a tacked on list of contributions. What are those about? What we got from them. How did we get it from them? Not a clue. Did it fly? I always like to talk about a sort of great world warehouse of contributions where culture reps go with shopping carts and sort of pull things down, off of the shelves. And instead of sort of, how did paper come from China, eventually to the West? Was that the only destination where it went? No, it had lots of places in between. You can trace these things. You can understand, complex ideas like Chinese paper being used to write in Indian numerals to express Greek mathematical ideas that were then picked up by Mediterranean scholars and bookkeepers in doing trade across the Mediterranean. That's the complex story of paper, not we got paper from the Chinese, right? They weren't really making good use of it, but we sure did, right? We got printing. All kinds of things like this happen in this model. But the worst of it is, including these topics, is only civilizations need apply. But many regions without major civilizations were very important in world history, and they find no place, not least of which were oceans as great interacting zones, and deserts, which were great interacting zones. So a couple of from my rogues gallery, from my dissertation, I studied teaching about the world in India, Egypt, and Britain after World War II. And I looked at a whole rogues gallery, and I looked also into the origins of this thing called the World History Textbook. And this is one of the early ones from the 1830s. And so what you get here is Peter Parley. And if you can see how this idea of what civilization is, the various stages of civilization. So up top, you know, we have sort of people living in tents and caves and whatnot. And then you have sort of, you know, more complex civilization with some monuments and stuff. And then you have what might be called the pageant of civilizations, which includes the so-called non-West in many curricula. And then, of course, here, the pinnacle of civilization in 1830 was starting to look like what? Industrialization. You've got a train in there, you've got factories and smoke coming up out of these, you know, these smokestacks. And so the idea of, you know, where do we place these people on the scale? And a lot of what happened in those days was that when Europeans in the 18th, 17th, you know, from the first era of globalization, from 1500 on to 1800, discovering that there were other civilizations out there, even though the word wasn't used in that same way as it would later on be racialized and all kinds of things. But there was a recognition that complex societies with great artistic and scientific achievements existed and that they had enormously long timelines. This was very hard to swallow and accept, but archaeology came along and gradually began to convince people that yes, they were. But how did you then rationalize the fact that the West was explaining its own inexorable rise at that time and expressing itself by colonizing these countries? How were they then explaining these magnificent civilizations that we were plundering in order to fill our museums with beautiful stuff at that time? Was to say, well, you know, they were there and they were then, but they were in decline, whereas we are now on a different trajectory. So one of the patterns that's in these textbooks is to cover them, yes, and you'll see in a moment how that goes, but then clear the decks by 1500 for a story that is then the rise of Europe. And these impressions are what researchers have found stick the most in students' minds. It's not the facts about this, this, and this. It's this overall impression. It's the way it's framed. It's the way that, you know, people think that the sequence of civilizations is linear when in fact it's not linear at all. It's as you'll see, much more complex. So this is, you're going to see now how these bubbles appear. These are the chapters in most world history textbooks, in quotes, and they are the basic sequence that emerged in the 19th century of the Western Civ sequence of its own becoming, which combines two things, and this was with the aid of archaeology, with the aid of biblical scholarship, and just generally the study of history, that joined in the course of the 19th century, in the course of making this a product for mass consumption, mass education, was the classical heritage of Greece and Rome, married to the biblical heritage of the Near East, Mesopotamia, the Holy Land, and so on and so forth. And this became the sequence. And you see it here in the way ancient Egypt was then discovered, the archaeology, bringing up these monuments out of the ground, discovering the pyramids, being, you know, the Rosetta Stone, all of that stuff. And then, of course, it emerges into classical Greece, which very seldom gets any credit in those older books at all. It's just barely beginning to, of Greece's achievements of connections with Africa, for example, or with ancient Egypt, or any of those things. It was like, well, it just emerged, right, as this grand thing. So the sequence continues then with Rome, and then goes on. This is the older books, medieval Europe, Renaissance exploration, scientific revolution, and so on. But what happened with multiculturalism? I don't know if any of you did read the article called The Two World Histories, which I was able to distribute, but you can always read it later. It's from Social Education, the Social Studies Association. It's very influential in curriculum across the states. So what happened with the advent of multiculturalism was to say, well, wait a minute, there is more to world history than the sequence of how Europe became. Why? Because people were here and said, well, but the Chinese, and there were scholars, of course, out there backing them up, you know, well, the Chinese had enormous contributions to, you know, the inventions we have today. And the Arabs stood up, and yes, it was algebra, but, you know, Indian numerals and, you know, the contributions of India and Persia and all of these other societies. that were brought in. So gradually, there was more space given to other, what they call non-Western societies, Eastern societies. The idea of the Orient, in German, the word for Orient is Morgenland, meaning the land of the rising sun, and Abendland, the land of the setting sun, is then the West. So how did these societies get put in when they were sort of added? Because the very, very oldest books had something on India and had something on China. Don't even ask about Africa because it was the dark continent. We didn't know anything about Africa, right? We could have, but in Egypt is not really part of Africa. Very strange things. But anyway, when they were added in larger amounts in the chapters on these on these societies, they were spliced into the sequence. And if PowerPoint reliably gave me vertical ability, I would show this as a kind of a spine of the orange parts that you see or the pink parts that you see. This is a sequence. And then it would look like a skeleton holding like too many shopping bags, because these things were then spliced in somewhere. And what I noticed when I would analyze them in the table of contents is that in the reality of the timeline of when these societies that were spliced in existed, meant that students in reality were experiencing a chronology that was throwing them back and forth thousands of years from one chapter to the other, but experienced as one after the other linear. Ending with what? Ending with the sequence that starts with 1500, with the Age of Exploration, when there's no more coverage of those until they appear as colonized countries, and after the war, developing countries. But the medieval pageant of civilizations that was here, shown after classical Rome, is like, wow, I call that the parade float model of teaching history. You stand your students on the curb, and one beautiful float after, China, India, gorgeous garden, and then they're gone. They're around the corner and they're gone. Not, they're not followed through in any organic way. And then you have the real exposure to what this means comes with the way sub-Saharan Africa and the Americas are covered in the sequence. And still it sits in so many books. So you've done the linear sequence, you've covered the great civilizations of the Eastern Hemisphere along with the classical sequence in Rome. But then just before the Age of Exploration, students are thrown back all the way to the very beginning, prehistoric, of history in Africa and in the Americas. Just before what happens? Before they're decimated by colonialism. So this really already sets up a situation. And again, then, you have a sequence then here, this one across the middle, of relatively small spans of time that, are 50 years, 100 years or so, covering the story of the rise of Europe. And how does that turn out then? Again, imperialism, even if there's a certain sense in many of those chapters of like guilt about it, not being good, but what I've tracked in actual textbooks, very, very little in the way of voices of the colonized in those books. But what you do have is declarative sentences with an active verb being a European colonizing nation and a past, acting upon an object with action verbs, the object being a colonized country. I track these sorts of things. It's punishing, but, but nonetheless. So this would fit in my estimation as brand X. So here's what the cost is in covering world history this way, creating this impression. Traditional world history covered a very small part of the world's surface and only expanded its scope with modern expansion of Europeans after 1400 CE. It focused on the Mediterranean, you'll shortly see why, but gradually added others. But what you're leaving out of the world are the interacting zones of the oceans, the Indian Ocean being the primary one early, of even the Mediterranean as an active, sense of interaction. And you've left out most of the planet because you're focusing on, were they a civilization? Can we cover them? Are they worthy? And so here's a map that shows how this goes back. This is from 1881, a chronological chart which is still sold on like the social studies catalogs. It's been updated to cover from Adam to Ronald Reagan. Sorry, anyway. But this map is at the beginning. And I want to read you the quote here because it's Sebastian Adams. This was like the understanding of what history was. And Eric Wolf has written a book called, The People Without History. It's part of the title. And so this shows you what they meant by the people without history. So this little, right there under where it says Eastern Hemisphere, the bright colors denote these countries that are the subjects of history previous to the discovery of America, all clustered around the Mediterranean, and the rest empty, completely empty, never mind the New World. So these were considered the countries worthy of study. You can go to Hegel and other, thinkers about history to see how they justified that. But often the inclusion criteria for a civilization is, did they have an empire? Did they have a great man? Can we count what we got from them through it? And so on. So it's really between that and the scales of civilization, it becomes really problematic. Add the Mercator map in and you're sunk. You've got your impression for life, basically. So what is the third possibility? And then I'll be looking at how these focus on policy in a few minutes. So option 3 is the world history perspective. This is a new model that emerged largely by historians working from the interwar period until very recently, who, having amassed a lot of knowledge about their discipline, saw the limitations of the civilizations-based narrative, much less the Western Civ part of that narrative. Even the pageant of medieval civilizations was too small a boundary. A lot of the historians who started critiquing this were looking at Islamic history, which simply, like any other religion, doesn't fit in the bounds of an empire, however long one of those lasted. So they're looking for a different model than this elegant sequence that I showed you on the map with bubbles, or on the chart with the bubbles. Instead, what they came up with is a way to unify knowledge about world history as it was being gathered over time by many specialists in disciplines who were working in their own little silos. Somebody's an expert on, 14th century Italian, Northern Italian, painting and culture, and somebody else is working on, this and this thing about the Islamic world and China and so on. And this is an effort to bring together and synthesize knowledge through a teaching model, which is how the world history model grew up. And the new unit of organization is, again, the global era of human history. What was going on in the globe across this period of time? And it takes students through this era by era tour, and I'll show you a very elegant way to graph it. Dynamic coverage of geography's role in human history. Inclusion of regional societies, civilizations, and the spaces between them. You no longer need to have a debate. Is it worthy to be in the curriculum? Was it a civilization or not? It was what was important about it at this particular time? What role did it play in interactions between societies? And the most important thing about this model is it allows teaching about interactions among cultures and long-term historical process as a topic of study, as opposed to the description of a civilization. So it's very fluid and it's very flexible. And of course, the most important thing is that it overcomes this idea of, well, multiculturalism. Who needs multiculturalism? Who needs to study these other societies? Is it because I have a classroom that has, is very diverse, and that's why we should teach it so everybody sees themselves represented? Whereas if I go to Westchester County, and it's not very diverse, maybe it is now by this time, but they don't need to because they're a fairly homogeneous group and they should learn about their identity. Or is it something that, we're learning about the world? We're learning what happened, who is in it, what goes on. And so it really overcomes the academic handicap assigned to multiculturalism as this kind of netherland between the important idea of conveying Western civilization and its values and its sequence and all of that, and making people feel a sense of identity with it, and sort of just a scattershot thing about the world. Or constituency-based teaching that brings you into certain content because you have people next to you who are from Vietnam or from here or from there. So it's academically challenging and culturally flexible, and especially it's paired with skill development, gathering information, using primary sources, looking at also this huge list of historical thinking skills that are incorporated into this model. And mainly, it incorporates most of the new and important research going on today. This is what it looks like. It doesn't matter how you cut the eras. There could be 10 or 6 or whatever number. It doesn't even matter exactly where you cut them, though most of the periodization is sort of cut at the milestones of Western Civ, not surprising. 1500 plays a role, the end of Rome plays a role, but at least you're looking at the world as a whole. And if you think about it, and I've talked about, like, going back to that first slide about, you know, students being bearers of collective learning and witnesses to history and so on. So this is basically like a graph in which geography, the surface of the Earth, is the horizontal axis, and time is the vertical axis. And you all know from math, even though I'm a humanities person and kind of handicapped in math, a graph can have an infinite number of points of x convergence between an x and a y, from one axis to the other. So potentially everybody and everything is in there. Now, you're not going to teach that in the survey course from June to September, or September to June, but you're definitely going to be able to position students to know that there's a heritage, that you and your family and your ancestors are in there somewhere. Everything that ever happened is in there somewhere. So it sets a framework of a place to put things when you learn new things. Not to say, well, I studied those civilizations, so who were they? Where do I put that knowledge? So it is very elegant. And then here, the regional societies, you can call them civilizations. I call them the major appliances of the world history curriculum, you know, the Renaissance and this and that. You put them in there, but you put them side by side in their era. And then you look at the spaces between them. And then you look at the ways and spaces and arenas in which they interacted, or the objects that represent those kinds of interactions that end up in our museums. Or you look at oceanic zones that aren't even land at all, and look at who was traversing those oceans and why and when and so on. You can follow themes like technology. You can follow agriculture, trade. The spread of religions never stayed within the bounds. The major world religions never stayed within the bounds of empires, or however, whatever duration you look at. And so you can also see the continuity, where you don't just cover a very short period of a civilization when it's supposed to be having had its golden age, you know, and then it declined and then we sort of drop it. You're looking at continuity in all of these things, and yet the ability to put it in a spatial framework that gives students exposure to the world. I compare the Civ-based to having students visit a portrait gallery of individual civilizations where they wander from one portrait to the other, to taking your students into a landscape to explore and look at the different areas that are there and who's in them and who's in the landscape with you. So its virtues are, and it by the way is embodied in, it was embodied in the National Standards for History that was published in the mid-1990s, and we'll talk about that shortly. It is gradually working its way into university survey courses. It's worked its way across the standards. I did a study around 2000 of the standards across the country. Did they reflect that new model or not? Many did, maybe in the rubrics, but not necessarily not necessarily in the application, and certainly not in regular kid textbooks. AP history textbooks, yes, but not regular kid textbooks. So it's comprehensive, global in scope, human-centered, inclusive, developed by hundreds and hundreds of international world historians and geographers. And again, that academically sound rationale for inclusion rather than multiculturalism. And it's accepting of new scholarship and research to encourage lifelong learning. Why it's important, if you even went to number 4 first, it's sustained citizenship. And now we come back to what Tatyana was talking about. How do people see others? How do they see how we got to where we are and who is in, you know, not ranking people, but just knowing how we came to this point of view? It makes sense of globalization because globalization is nothing new. And world history demonstrates our expanding knowledge about the past based on archaeology, based on textual studies, based on just all kinds of things. And it shows links, of course, from national history to the rest of the world. This model implies that when we teach national history, we should teach not planet America or planet Germany or France, but rather America in the world. How did world history impact on the United States? You can't even think of American history without context of world history because of how it started, as we understand it, that is today. So a couple of sort of critiques that we come to, and I didn't set a timer, so somebody's gonna have to keep me honest here. But I'm gonna go through now sort of the policy side of things and have a look at what exists right now out there and what I think is at stake in this. Hold on, I don't know how I flipped down all that, but anyway, okay. So this is just a very slim example of what, even in the mid-1990s, this is a textbook that was used in California, specifically written for a very interdisciplinary curriculum. There's a highlighted place right up here. This is the before and the after. I worked with textbook companies, including Houghton Mifflin, to try to improve what they were doing. But here's a quote. This is about the period before the Renaissance, but after Rome. And it says here, you know, there were these travelers out there, but even so in other words, yes, there were those travelers, and we know who they were and when they had lived and where they went. But even so, until about 1500, people knew little about what lay beyond the region at the center of nearly every map home. Well, demographically, that may be true, but there were plenty of people moving. The greatest geographer and mapmaker during the Roman Empire was Ptolemy, who lived until 168 CE. He used information. Unfortunately, Ptolemy's work was forgotten as the Roman Empire declined. For the next 1,000 years, maps gave a distorted view of the world. Whose maps? Chinese maps? Maps made by Africans? Maps made by Polynesians sailing on the seas using the knowledge of currents? Whose maps? Maps, all maps, right? So in the early 1400s, scholars found copies of Ptolemy's work. The rediscovery and publication of these manuscripts. Well, they were getting them out of libraries that were, you know, put in use in Spain by, you know, Arab geographers and stuff like that. I mean, this is just the kind of generalization that keeps reinforcing that view of dismissal of others. So I could show you what the after looks like, and I will share this PowerPoint with the program if you like. But trying to just, you know, use a little bit of sense to like here for this first paragraph here, each new journey provided map makers with another small piece of the world. This is from beyond Europe. Chinese, Indian, Persian, Arab, African, and Polynesian peoples also used their geographic knowledge to make maps. I mean, it's a very simple statement, but it's very powerful because it's just plain not people's maps, you know, did that or the other thing. So it gives you some substance to it. This is a very typical map of when books started to say, well, we're going to globalize and we're going to have these map spreads between the units, and we're going to show the world connections. So in 1200 CE, you have a map that shows a bunch of empires here and there, and then you have the Silk Roads. You could have had this map be 1,000 years before, and it would still have the same darn Silk Road on it and nothing else. And what you see then in the 1500 map is, woo, all these European explorers going out exploring. Right, this is what a map that historians know looked like in 1200 with trade routes. Complete is called, in fact, in the world history model, it's called the era of intensified hemispheric interactions. They couldn't find a harder name than that for kids, so they used that. But you see the difference between this and this, right? You get the idea from these Western Civ textbooks and their progenitor, you know, their descendants, even through today. You get the impression that towns and trade emerged in Europe, rather than the idea that you can look at a map by, you know, a book by Philip Curtin and see a whole array of cities over a certain population, below a certain population, ones that existed before 1000 CE, ones that existed afterwards. And then you see the cluster of towns and trade in Europe growing around 1200, 1300, 1400. Joining. One of my favorite expressions is from the economist A.G. Frank, who wrote a book called Reorient, a big, thick book. He's an economist frustrated by what he found with economics. And he summarized the joining of Europe of global trade. Sorry about that. And what he said was, Europe bought a ticket on the Asian trade train with American silver. right? And with regard to how researchers came up with the idea that Europeans developed the global economy on their own, he said it was like a drunk who lost his keys on the street, and he's found looking under the street light circle, you know, under the lamp, and they go like, "Is that where you lost your keys?" He said, "No, but that's where the light is." Why is that? Because they're using European sources to document the rise of the global economy. So he's a real wag, but he's a very useful wag. And the book is full of substance. So a couple of, just a quick tour through some of the standards so you can look at what's at stake in the policy. The coming of standards that were tested from the period of early 1990s to the mid 1990s and all the way to today. Some of the standards that were put together at that time are still in force today. I know I studied them, I could say ad nauseum. Just trying to see how close are we to moving to this other paradigm of using global eras instead of civilizations like we've been doing for almost 200 years. So what has happened is that two things. One is standards used to mean like a mimeograph bunch of binders that were put together and were put on a shelf. And in fact, the real standard of the States was whatever commercial textbooks there were in the classroom. That was the default standard for teaching world history in US and so on, but especially world history. Standards, however, did two things. One, they were tested. And two, they contained performance standards, which would mean that it wasn't just, you could theoretically take the old way and say, we teach this, 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 and this. I could stand teaching it to an empty class and I would have done my job. But now it's what is the student going to be able to do and be able to prove, which is fine, because we should be teaching that way anyhow, like based on what the student we hope will be able to do in skills and knowledge and so on and so forth. And interestingly enough, one of the major impetuses behind, or impeti, I don't know, behind standards was this thing, E.D. Hirsch's cultural literacy, which emerged as an important thing, a policy debate in the 1980s. We're becoming a nation that doesn't share a body of cultural literacy, whether it's the, Mother Goose, or whether it's, Mark Twain, or whether it's Leonardo da Vinci's painting, or whatever it is. And so the standards that were put together from one side, there were two different sides of the standards debate. One of them I call the glass half full, and the other one the glass half empty. The half empty people were like, Johnny doesn't know who's the president, and doesn't know his Mother Goose, and doesn't know, this and that. And the other thing, sort of the Jay Leno version of, going around with the microphone on the street and seeing how ignorant we are. And then the other glass half full people were like, there's been a huge lag between what scholars know and what's in the K-12 curriculum. What does a student need to know before they get up to college from having sat in school for 13 years in K-12? And how can we structure it for greater meaning? So the national standards effort represented the glass half full. The reaction to the national standards effort is the glass half empty people saying, wait a minute, there's not enough of Western Civ in here when it comes to history. And that's a whole thing you can pursue in a book by the people who coordinated the construction of the National Standards for History in UCLA, who wrote a book called History on Trial. It's very fascinating. It was one of the first right-wing media campaigns that, believe it or not, was led by Lynn Cheney, who was the head of the National Endowment for the Humanities that commissioned the side of the history standards in the first place, who then disavowed what they did and went into the media and talked about why that was a terrible thing. So this is from a couple of samples of curriculum standards, because they're now tested, high stakes testing. Even the kids who take AP history, which is much broader, in Virginia still have to take the standards of learning test, where the scholarship that goes into the one and the other is diametrically opposite. And yet they still have to go in there, so you have to sign them. Like the model that I think about is like, okay, the standards of learning in Virginia are kind of in there somewhere, like you can mummify them in a little, case, sarcophagus, but then the rest of world history is there. So I say to teachers, standards are a floor, not a ceiling. Remember that. Standards are a floor, not a ceiling. It's not like, oh, I can't teach it because it's not in the standards. If it's not in the standards, it wasn't history. That's not how that process ever worked on the political level or any other way. So you had in Virginia, and I'll just draw your attention to the 8.5 one, the original standards written before they were revised finally in 2000 had the entirety of world history being written in terms of these kinds of things. The student will analyze this, and this one's about the Muslim world, the conflict between the Muslim world and Christendom, and almost all of them ended with, in terms of its influence on Western civilization. Even the one on ancient Egypt said that. So the ancient Egyptians woke up every morning and said, how can I influence Western civilization today? And if they went to sleep at night and had not done so, they should feel inadequate, right? I mean, what can I say? Okay. So here's one from Massachusetts on the Middle East also, which is sort of a bunch of bullet lists of words. Persistent nationalism, militarism, conflicts of race, religion, ethnicity of the Middle East, religion, oil, dictatorships, the Gulf War, right? I mean, that's history. And then you have, you know, various other ones that come out that way. I wanted to show you some that talk about the non-West and the non-Middle East. So you have an omnibus standard, and this is in California where they draped world history across grade 6, grade 7, and grade 10, which is really revolutionary. You actually have time to go into it instead of failing to do it 3 times. You actually have a good shot at doing it once, but across the grades. But this is the sort of cookie cutter that even in that context of 10th grade being modern history, students analyze instances of nation building in the contemporary world in at least 2 of the following regions or countries: Middle East, Africa, Mexico, other parts of Latin America, and China. That's the cookie cutter standard for the rest of the world. The other parts of this are about World War I and World War II and what happened after, you know, in Europe and all that stuff. And so here's the bullet points, you know, important trends, recent history. It becomes very reminiscent of the geography books that present these as kind of intractable problems in those places that are the non-West. Here is a way where you can see in the standards, which again are tested, how the world is divided up. Summarize the fundamentalizes culture. Student understands the development of ideas. This is only one of many categories, but it says summarize the fundamental ideas and institutions of Eastern civilizations that originated in China and India. Well, they didn't all originate in China and India, I'm sorry. Summarize the fundamental ideas and institutions of Western civilizations that originated in Greece and Rome, as if they all originated in Greece and Rome, or the entire West, whatever that is. And a lot of the Middle East, interestingly, is due west of Europe, you know, like Morocco and stuff. And then where's the room for interactions among people? How these ideas were exchanged from here to there and there to here, you know. Let me contrast this with one thing that one of the people who worked on a wonderful curriculum called World History for Us All, Edmund Burke III, who hates to be called Edmund Burke III, is Terry, so I'm not surprised. But he's a wonderful historian who took the idea that I know a 6th grade student once asked me. She says, so what? Who invented algebra, or who invented the telescope, or who this or who that? What difference does it make? And she said, besides that, oh, you're just saying that about algebra because you're Muslim. No, you know, it was like, this is what happened. You can study the interactions. So what he said was that what difference it makes is that there were he named 6 of them, technological complexes that developed through collective interactions among various societies that brought us writing complexes, how to rule people, bureaucracies. We call it a writing bureaucratic complex. So how do you govern people using record keeping? Metallurgy, what do you call it? He called it the arts of fire. This was a wonderful exhibit at the Getty. The arts of fire, mining, ceramics, glass making. That's one of them. The arts of transportation, maritime skills at building ships and navigating them and so on. So all these complexes, an astronomical, philosophical complex, astronomy, mathematical, all these kinds of things, that these complexes developed in the interactions among various societies in various arenas of the Eastern and then the Western Hemisphere. And that is what gave us modernity. That's what modernity and modern technology depends on, that collective learning and accumulation over time, which started with the toolkits He calls them toolkits, not just technological complexes, starting with the Neolithic period, how to tie knots, how to dress a skin, things like how do you catch birds, how do you move a megalith, things like that. So this is a significance that is completely lost when you look at things in this manner. And so what a student can acquire in terms of understanding is that almost nothing that we know today that is a cornerstone of who we are technologically didn't pass through many hands and many lands, usually by a very complex path. That's a very different message from what we got from them, I think. And so we need to embed it in the standards. Another one here that is a hallmark of the sort of, I would call it the conservative or the glass half full folks, would be, what should you study in a world history curriculum? This is a document from the late 80s. It has many good things, but again, it does emphasize connections among civilizations, gradual growth of global interaction, but it says down here that it should require only close study of one or two selected non-European societies. For what? To achieve the interest and power of a good story. Not because they were there and played important roles in the nexus, of the period of intensified hemispheric interactions, if you will, but because, hey, like we can do it. But only one or two. We don't have time because we have a long job to do in communicating the rest of it. I invite you, because my time has certainly run out, to look at World History for Us All, which is an alternative curriculum that is built to compensate for that. There's a number of other ones I could show you. And I could show you also what the National Standards for History did in terms of the sort of complexity that we're looking for in studying history. This is just one of Standard on Africa. It looks very different from the one that I showed you. And one of the interesting things about the standards that are out there today is that some of the states just pulled out the rubrics from the national documents and left the skeleton to be the standards, often reflecting on what's in the textbooks rather than what scholars are saying, is a cutting edge in research. So they only pulled out these rubrics. The Common Core has even thrown that out and left nothing but a framework, a diffused and fragmented framework of skills that you can scattershot, hopefully cover in the classroom. What we have done is thrown and made the national standards effort in the mid-1990s was the first all the way across the curriculum reform movement in the United States to bring the level of scholarship up since World War I. Put that in your mind to think about it. Mid-1990s, from the end of World War I, when kind of globally people did a reassessment of what are we teaching kids. All across the curriculum to bring up to date the enormous amount of scholarship amassed in that period of time, especially even in the post-war period, didn't get reflected systematically in curriculum until the mid-1990s when it was published, with an effort between scholars in the fields and teachers in the classroom who interpreted how can you spread this across K-12. Hugely important movement. What did we do with it in the United States? We threw it down the American education memory hole, where so many things go to die until we come up with the next thing, which is now the Common Core, or the this or the that. And we have forgotten that we have these amazingly rich documents that laid out, not only, and this is how I want to conclude here, not only a framework for teaching each subject, but a curriculum map that allows us to teach science together with social studies, with humanities, with arts, in a beautiful symphony that many private school students are privy to, but the public schools cannot seem to get out of their silos of committees and standards, regulations in order to implement. And so what did we do in order to agree on content after the big brouhaha that erupted after the publication of the National History Standards? In order to have a national Common Core that everybody could agree on, they took out the content and left the skills, which were already there anyway. I'm not joking. And I'm not even pessimistic, because we do persistent teaching. And since the states couldn't eliminate the content completely, it's still sitting in there from the late 1990s and into the early 2000 decade. This core is still sitting there. But how much richer if you look at the national standards for history in world and US, you will see a much richer approach to incorporating scholarship, to breaking things down, to asking students to inquire about history rather than be told what to think. Instead, they're being taught how to think. If you just look at the one on Africa that I pulled up here, I mean, how much more complex it is, this being from the 19th to the 20th centuries. So I'm done. I've taken you on a longer journey than I was supposed to, but I hope that we recognize that you as students and future, you're already scholars, can recognize when you see what's going on in public debate. Journalists have covered this public debate around standards very poorly. They've taken it as either the same way they do elections, it's a nice catfight to cover, or they've just taken everything at face value. But you need to be able to look behind what's the meaning behind these things. And of course, I'm sure that your mind has been working, that this has something to do with the resurgence of the ideas of white nationalism, of the idea of preserving Western civ. Remember what King said the other day when he was called on the carpet about white supremacy. And he said, yeah, but I spent all this time in the classroom learning about Western civ and its virtues. What's wrong with that? Well, nothing except it's rather incomplete. So that's where I want to rest my argument and hope that you will know what's at stake. And one of the other backgrounds of why there's so much at stake with this and how people will learn to see the world is that students in K-12, in high school, especially middle and high school, may be getting the only exposure systematically and slow enough to world history that they will ever get as they go through life. And those teachers, and I work with them, I'm actually, education outreach coordinator at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, in addition to my national workshops at the CMCU. Those teachers are teaching like their hair's on fire. As they say, the expression is a wonderful book was written about that. Because they want to convey this, there's so much at stake. For us to have a reasonable impression of who is in the world with us and how did we come to be where we are. And where should we be going?
Thank you very much.
You.
But I want to ask some questions. We have a little bit of time for questions, both of our presenters today. Charlotte, you have a question.
Yes. So our question is the plans for training teachers to teach the new history curriculum, because we know the students are getting far, getting tired of the same lesson plans. So I guess my question is the plans to train teachers, but also how do you the accountability in after? How do you, because you mentioned the sequence of 6, 7, and 10th grade, and because of the dynamics of school. A lot of it feels cost effective, having books and things. How do you sustain that students are all over the country are being taught the same thing in history, 6, 7, and 10, and not following on?
Well, fortunately, they're not being taught the same thing all over, but unfortunately, the most cutting edge world history teaching is advanced placement, which is a tough course. There are, however, teachers doing it, and many teachers who picked up teaching AP World History and also teach regular 9, 10 grade classes, they can't go back to that Western Civ thing. They just can't. So they do what they can to incorporate it. Textbooks have become like dinosaurs, honestly. I mean, the companies have merged and merged and re-merged. Some of the books that are the most highest selling ones in the country actually go back in their texts to the 80s. And they haven't been substantially rewritten since. Because of that right-wing media storm that erupted after the national standards, mostly about US history, but also peripherally about world history, scared the textbook companies about their bottom line to the point that they would have loved to write a national textbook with the new scholarship, and we were working with editors at the time, but they were scared off doing it. And there were standards companies, and if you read the article called The Two World Histories, you'll see who the constituents are. It's been distributed online to this audience. Who the constituents were: the multiculturalists, the Western Civ advocates that say this is too much, too diverse, and then the world history model people that were fighting for like a world history that's global, and you're talking about all that. But there's a great variety. I mean, I do this professional development all the time, and what we do is to bring what are the alternatives to just using the textbook? What are some slim narratives you can use that give a picture? But then what can you do to step back from this narrative of civilizations to look at the world as a whole during these periods of time, and to understand even what the difference is between the units of organization, between geography, you civ by civ, and then eras, as a global model. So there's hope. There's hope.
Question right here.
Hi, I have a question for you. I wanted to know how often these videos are being played in classrooms, and I want to know how do you go about asking teachers to play them, because it's going to bring about uncomfortableness on the part of the teachers and the students, but I feel like this will help to prevent maintaining that like white supremacy thinking. So yeah, just your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. In terms of how often, I'm going to go here because I know we're Facebook Live, right? In terms of how often, I have no idea. I do know that, sometimes people tell me things that I really don't have a way to track that. I would love to know because I would be super curious. It's like, where is it being shown across the country? Because my hunch is that it's being shown in places where people are like-minded, right? Like, so is it being, so that's my hunch. Does it make people uncomfortable? It may, but I think there are things happening in schools, like kids yelling, build that wall, right? So there's already lots of uncomfortable things happening in schools, and this is hopefully a way for students to really understand the stories and not just kind of the hate that's emerging with this discourse. So I do know also on the flip side of that, some teachers have told me stories where they will have debates, which I also think actually are quite dangerous in a classroom around immigration, because you don't want to put a student on a side, like, you're going to talk about why we should deport everyone, right? And their mother or their uncle is one of those people, right? So I think we have to be careful, but where students have been very strong, like, no, if you didn't come the quote unquote right way, you shouldn't be here. And then they come to uncover that they actually themselves are undocumented, right? And so that is the way that they are protecting themselves from being seen for, for that reality. So I think, is it going to be a hard conversation? Yes, but again, it's starting from somebody else. We're not pointing to any one student's reality. And at the end of the day, you look for yourself first. There's this great analogy somebody showed, like, those, like, when you go to a wedding and everyone's like, okay, your table picture, and everyone lines up and it's like this weird picture. But what do you look for when you see that picture? Where am I? How do I look? Cute, not cute, whatever. And then you look at everyone else, right? And so that's the same thing with history, right? And that's why I think Susan was saying it shouldn't be the same, because it depends on who we are, but we start from where we are and then we expand. So I think students need to see their realities, and we can't just, I'm in New York and I love Ellis Island, and if you haven't been to the Museum of Ellis Island, it's fascinating, but we can't just talk about immigration through the perspective of Ellis Island, right? We have to go beyond that to our students' current immigration realities and their families. So I think it's critical. It's hard, but we have to do it, because if we're not doing it in school, it's happening in other places, and school should be a safe place to have those hard conversations.
Well, and who did the Southwest United States belong to up until fairly recently? New Mexico?
Right.
If you don't know that, and you don't know what happened with Central Asian economy, Central American economies, across the period of colonization, you wouldn't understand the pressures under which people migrate.
I think we're out of time because I think we lose this room at 2 o'clock. We're going to continue the conversation with the master's students downstairs, where we've got some lunch. Everyone's actually welcome to join us as well if you want to come down. We've got some food down there, so please. And we'll continue that down. We're down in suite 171. So come on down. So we'll see the other students who are down there. Okay. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Did I go to Penn?
Yeah.
What's that?
Oh, you
I
did?
did Georgetown. And of course, I'm familiar with the scholarship and everything. So
I was a teacher in Atlanta for 3 years.
Oh, really? Really?
Yeah, it was included.
That's where my office is.
Yeah.
Were you,
I think so, yeah.